Hello, social studies teachers. Here's an example of how we can think aloud our thoughts as we model for students how to annotate text. We're going to start with the social studies annotation marks. It's important that students understand what each of these symbols mean so that they can use them in meaningful ways as they read the text. I advise having students really become experts of one to two symbols that they really gravitate towards. Teaching them all of the symbols, but then having them use maybe their favorite ones or the ones they can most remember when they're first learning how to annotate. So I would suggest going over each of the symbols and then asking students which one do they relate to the most or do they understand the most, and having them use that symbol as they start with annotation. So let's go to the background essay. And I'm going to just focus on circling powerful words or phrases and underlining words or phrases that I don't understand. One of the things to consider when teaching students how to use the DBQ online platform is teaching them how to use the tools that are available to them. In the top left-hand corner, you see all of the tools that are available to students for annotating the text. Now, since we're just going to focus on circling powerful words or phrases or underlining words or phrases that we don't know, I'm just going to circle on the oval and the underline at this point. Something else to keep in mind that students need an example of or a modeling of is that each time you circle a powerful word or phrase or underline a word that you don't understand, it's important to make note of why you underlined or circled that particular word or phrase. Inform students that we do this because oftentimes when we go away from the text and then come back to the text, we may forget why we underlined or circled certain words or phrases. And this is a good reminder of why to do those things. Whenever we're annotating a text or looking at a text with students, it's very important that we start with the title of a text and annotate that for them as well and explain to them what our thinking is as we annotate that title. So now I'm going to switch from speaking to teachers into instructing as if I were instructing students. Hello, students. Thank you for joining. We are going to annotate this background essay for the DBQ. And the background essay provides us with important context and information that will help us to understand how to answer the question of the DBQ. It's an important essay to have a great understanding of. And what we're going to do today is we're going to annotate the background essay. We're going to start by numbering each of the paragraphs so that when we come back to make note of the text, we are clear about which paragraphs we are referencing when we speak about the text in class. So here we have paragraph 1. Then we have paragraph 2. And paragraph 3. Now, for today's instruction, I am going to model the first 3 paragraphs and then release you and a partner to annotate paragraphs 4 and 5, and then independently you will annotate paragraph 6 and paragraph 7. Let me start out with the title of this paragraph: Famine in Ethiopia. How did the government make it worse? There's a lot of information that is assumed that I know by that title, but based on the title, my first thinking is famine in Ethiopia. That sounds like it will be powerful or important to this text. And I'm going to make a note. Again, each time you underline or circle anything in the text, you should make note of why it was important for you to circle it. So I'm going to go ahead and take note. And the reason why famine in Ethiopia stood out to me is because I believe that the text will tell me more about famine in Ethiopia. I also think that I should circle the word famine because it's a word that I want to know more about. I'm not exactly sure what a famine is, what happens during a famine, who does it impact. And those are the exact questions that I'm going to leave on the text. Again, every time I circle or underline, I want to leave a note so that when I come back to the text, I'll remember my thinking. So, what is famine? How does it impact people or land? How did the government make it worse? Okay. That's a good question. And I'm going to go ahead and underline that as well. But really, there's so much in that one question that I have more to think about. First off, I'm wondering if it is referring to the famine. I'm going to circle it. And I'm also wondering, when they say government, do they mean the government of Ethiopia? And I think these are pretty important questions to consider before I read my text. So I'm going to take a sticky note and it. Does this mean the famine? Did the government make the famine worse for the people? And again, this is something that I think I'll learn as I read the text. And it takes me back to that how. How did the government do this if they did? And then, of course, I circled government because government, and they meaning the government of Ethiopia. So these are my initial questions as I look at the title of the text. And I'm going to see if some of those questions are answered as I read the very first 3 paragraphs of the text. So here we have Africa is a huge continent with 54 countries in a whole variety of landforms and languages. Wow, that's very powerful. I think it was important that they mentioned that Africa is a huge continent. Since we live in a country here in the United States of America, I think we often assume that other places around the world are also countries just as we are when we hear them named. But Africa is not a country, it actually has 54 countries within it. So that's something important to keep in mind. And again, if you are going to make note of something, it's important to take note. We assume that places are countries because we live in a country. Africa is a continent. Hmm. For what I know, continents are large land masses, and countries are smaller. That's important to keep in mind. Ethiopia, a country in eastern Africa, is larger than the state of Texas, has surprisingly diverse landscape. So it's Ethiopia is a country and it is larger than the state of Texas. I know Texas is a pretty large state, and they're comparing the size of Ethiopia to Texas. And they're also saying that it has surprisingly diverse landscape. Now, the reason that stood out to me is because earlier it says that there are a variety of land forms. Okay. So up here it says that countries and a country in Eastern, a variety of land forms, a wide variety of land forms. So I'm going to underline that. And the reason why I'm underlining it is because something similar is said in the second sentence. And I know that if something is repeated, then it must be important. So here we have a wide variety of landforms, and Ethiopia has a surprisingly diverse landscape. So the reason why I highlighted both of those is because I believe, since it's mentioned twice, that landscape and landforms are important to understanding famine, the famine in Ethiopia. Well, I'm assuming that because they say it twice, and usually when things are repeated, they're important and they're connected to the title in some way. So I'm not exactly sure how yet. So maybe I'll just put how are landscapes and landforms important to understanding famine in Ethiopia. All right. Now it's not really that important to have everything spelled exactly right. Or to have complete sentences when you're annotating. What's most important is capturing your thinking and to monitor how you are thinking as you annotate text. Okay, so let's go on. Tropical forests grow in the south. Deserts cover the north and east, where cattle, sheep, and other livestock still manage to find grasses to eat. In central Ethiopia, where the Blue Nile starts, the giant Rift Valley separates snow capped mountains and plateaus. Wow, that is a lot of different or diverse landscapes, as they said. So, as I'm thinking about this, in one area, you can have tropical forests, which I know are lush and leafy, and there's a lot of different insects in the forest. And that's in the south. And then deserts are without the lush greenery that are present in tropical forest. So you have lush greenery and then you have these barren deserts. And then you still have these places where the river is, that valleys and even snow-capped mountains. So you think about going from a snow-covered mountain to a desert where there is no greenery, no water at all. That is a very diverse landscape, as they said. And again, I'm just going to highlight this because I'm wondering how this diversity in landscape impacts famine. What does it have to do with famine? And you can always go back to that question of the DBQ or go back to the title and think about, well, how does this connect? Why is the author telling me this? How is this important? Sometimes we don't find out until later, but it's always good to have that question in mind and even to begin making some connections in your own mind if you can. So, to me, I'm thinking, well, maybe in those desert areas, people will have a hard time having access to food or water because I know that food and water go hand in hand. In order to have growing plants that people can eat or trees, you need water. And that doesn't happen so much in the desert areas. I'm also thinking about this graphic map that they have in the middle of the background essay. And I'm thinking about the description of these different areas and what does it mean. So they said that in the east, which would be to this side of the map, that it had, mm, let's go back to where it said the east. What was happening in the east? What's the landscape look like? Deserts covered the north and the east. So this is the north area at the top, and the east is over to the side. Wow. So as I'm looking at this map key tells me that everything colored in dark brown are areas where there's serious famine. So according to the description of the landscape, those areas of serious famine are happening in areas where they said there is desert. So my connections probably are right. And I'm going to make note of that because always remember that this graph is here to provide you with information as well. They place it there so that you can clarify your thinking, so that you can make connections. And I'm just going to take note that, as I was reading about and this is all coming from so far, are we hearing any information about how the government is impacting Ethiopia? No, so far we're hearing a lot about how the landscape, in particular the desert, is connected to the famine. And now we're hearing more about how the weather is connected to the famine. So we're going to go on and we're going to determine, how did the government make it worse? Now, when I'm looking back to that title to inform my thinking, make it worse stands out because that makes me believe that it was already a problem with the land. There were already some problems with the weather that could have caused this famine. But the government, in some way, made it worse. So, famine in Ethiopia, I know that from reading these very first sentences, I know that Ethiopia is a country in Africa. I know that it is a country that has diverse landscape, including desert. I know from the graph that in the north and in the east, in those areas of desert, those were areas of serious famine. And that makes sense to me because I know that you need water and greenery in order to have food. I also know that the weather in some way has impacted famine in Ethiopia. Now, my question is, how did the government make it worse? Already, the landscape, which they talk a lot about in paragraph 1, and the weather, which they talk about in paragraph 2, impacts famine in Ethiopia. How did the Ethiopia? Now, my question is, how did the government make it worse? Already, the landscape, which they talk a lot about in paragraph 1, and the weather, which they talk about in paragraph 2, impacts famine in Ethiopia. How did the government make it worse? So, What we're going to do is to continue reading to see how that happens. First, by going over the annotation symbols that will be used in your modeling, and then showing students how you think and apply those annotation symbols to the text, being very explicit in your demonstration. Some of the key tools to remember in instruction and to pass on to the students is to always go back to that document based question that is the title of each of these background essays, to number the paragraphs for future reference, to always make note whenever something is circled or underlined so that they could remember their thinking when they come back to the text. So releasing students to do this with a partner is important to do next. And I would suggest giving them at least 1 to 2 paragraphs that follow the paragraphs that you have annotated, and then having those pairs report out what important information did they find, what connections could be made in the text, and even how they are continuing to use the graphic in the middle of the background essay. And then once you have assessed that students have a firm understanding of circling the powerful words and phrases and underlining the words and phrases that they have questions about, then you can move into allowing students to work independently to annotate the last few paragraphs. Circling back to this last paragraph will be key as well, because in the last paragraph of the background essays, the buckets or the topics or the ways that the government made it worse will be clearly labeled in that last paragraph for most of the background essays. So, for example, government actions. What are those actions? Those can be separated into buckets. Government programs could be separated into buckets. And the focus is on how the government's actions and the government's programs contributed to the famine. So, again, releasing students to work independently, but being sure to come back to this last paragraph because it does often inform how you will label those buckets for more analysis of the DBQ. Thank you.